Okay, so again, thank you everyone for joining this webinar. And the title of my talk is asking how transnational education transforms privilege. And so this is actually my central research question as well, focusing on Chinese students in America pre and during the COVID. So thanks to Yao's introduction, and she already plugging my book. So this talk also draws in part from the research I've done for my book, which is Chinese students pre-COVID era. And I would also include my new research for their experience during the COVID. Today is really focusing on this notion of privilege and see how my research on transnational education really interrogating this notion of privilege as widely examined based on the Western elite students. Next slide, please. So first, I'd like to give you some sort of macro context here in terms of Chinese students' enrollment in the United States. So the graph really shows the decade data, enrollment data from 2005 to 2015, which is really the kinds of time period that I focus on in my book. As you can see, the increase at both undergraduate and graduate level, but the enrollment spike at undergraduate level is more dramatic. And around 2014, graduate students has actually become the secondary, and undergraduate students has become the majority of Chinese students population in the United States. And I've also included more recent statistics here, especially after Trump becoming president, and international student enrollment overall has taken a slump. But Chinese student enrollment continued to increase for a couple years. For example, in the academic year of 2016, grow by 6.8%. And in the academic year of 2017, the graduate student enrollment started to decline, but undergraduate student enrollment still grew by 4%. But that's obviously hit by a roadblock in 2020. We all know that's because of COVID. 23% of drop of international students overall in 2020. But in 2021, other countries have started to bounce back, but not for China. In 2021, the most recent year of applications, we have experienced 18% drop of Chinese applicants. I don't know whether that happens in Colombia, but this is based on a common app application system where 400 colleges registered their enrollment, and we see this nationwide drop of Chinese applicants. Next slide, please. So here are a couple of media headlines covering Chinese international students before the COVID. As you can see, the focus is really on their wealth. The golden generation, the lust for speed, their very conspicuous consumption patterns. Next slide, please. So I kind of summarize it in my book that the before Trump era, the narrative on Chinese students is really focused on the wealth, and they literally become the cash cow of American higher education. And there is a large critical views, and I share that view in my book as well, that American higher education has not done a sufficient job in providing the systematic support Chinese students deserve. But since the Trump era, there is a new narrative. The narrative going beyond the wealth, but focusing on the threat for national security, for American national interests in terms of the stealing of intellectual property, spying for the Chinese government, even trying to censor the free speech on American college campuses. So a threat narrative has emerged that is very much since Trump era, and it's still going on even after Biden administration started to take office. So the book that Yao has mentioned has used mixed method research, and I conducted the research between 2014 and 2012 and 2018, and I trying to present a nuanced and more balanced analysis going beyond the media headlines, focusing on the wealth, the threat narrative, and I think that kind of media coverage is very much dehumanizing Chinese students' experiences. So I present their own voices using both surveys and interviews data, trying to present a more nuanced analysis. Next slide, please. So what I find in general is a more a picture of a privileged but diverse portrait of Chinese students of this sort of younger generation as undergraduate studying in the United States. So the privileged part really centered on this is a largely urban population. So my survey data shows 95% of them coming from urban areas, the cities. And more importantly, the funding source is largely self-fund or using their family, their parents' money. So for the American higher education perspective, they're largely full-pay students. That's actually what this whole cash cow narratives is coming from. But what I also highlight is in spite of the privileged overall status, this is a largely diverse population. And I center the diversity based on two aspects. One is their family backgrounds. So even though this is a largely socioeconomically speaking privileged population, their parents are actually pretty diverse in terms of occupations and even education. So I highlight in particular the first generation college students status. So in other words, their parents have never been to college, but they send their kids to America for college, and of course elsewhere as well. And the other thing is their occupational status are extremely diverse. So a lot of our media headlines, and even I think in Chinese TV series as well, a lot of them are 富二代. Their parents are like entrepreneurs, CEOs. But what I found is a lot of them are coming from regular middle class families. Their parents are engineers, they're professors, they're even drivers and factory managers. So very diverse in terms of occupational status. And they're also coming from very diverse educational trajectory. So I identified 4 pathways for Chinese students coming to America. So for the first 2 pathways carries a large majority of them. They're coming from regular public schools. They're also coming from 国际部, the public schools with international divisions. And the minority of them are coming from 民办, the private schools, and also they went to American high schools first and then directly coming to college in the United States. So this very different educational trajectories also impinge upon their experiences in the United States as well. All right, so next slide, please. So what has COVID? That's actually really the focus of my current talk and research as well. What has COVID really changed their experiences? So largely, in the United States, we have seen a surge of anti-Asian hate, and that sometimes targeted Chinese students, sometimes are broadly Asian-based. And very close data shows, very recent data shows that close to 4,000 cases of anti-Asian hate crimes have been reported. And specifically for relevant to Chinese students is this escalating US-China tensions that really reflect in the visa restrictions. There are sort of tic-tac travel bans and visa restrictions starting from the spring of 2020. And what I want to really point out is this 5-1 policy Chinese government instituted in 2020 literally shut Chinese students and overseas Chinese out of their own country. So out of fear of infections. So in other words, this is a very unique case that Chinese students during the year of 2020 have found in an extremely difficult situation that they felt they were pushed out of both their host country and their home country. Of course, things start to change later on, but that particular period, I think it's very unique to Chinese international students. Next slide, please. So this talk is really trying to interrogate this notion of privilege. So theory on privilege, I want to highlight is that it's very Western-centric and primarily based on the study of elites in the West. And in a nutshell, the literature on the Western elite conclude that privilege really embodies on this notion of ease. And the studies are based on the classic studies by Bourdieu in French societies, and also Shamus Khan's study with the same book title of Privilege, which is based on the American context. So both of major streams of work are largely informed by sort of Bourdieusian conversion of capital. So this notion of how economic capital can be converted to human capital and cultural capital almost in an invisible and seamless manner. And in that way, intergenerational transmission of privileges are materialized. So I think that's really the long-standing tradition, very influential tradition of studies of privilege in the Western world. And what I want to point out today is how the study of based on Chinese students can challenge that long-standing conclusions on privilege. Next slide, please. So let's first take a close look at how Bourdieu really defined ease based on the French context. So this is a study Bourdieu published in 1996, and I quote, how Bourdieu defined ease. Thus, when in the indefinable nuances that define ease or natural talent, we think we recognize behavior or ways of speaking considered authentically cultured because they bear no mark of the effort and no trace of the work that go into their acquisition. We are really referring to a particular mode of acquisition. What we call ease is the privilege of those who, having imperceptibly acquired their culture through a gradual familiarization in the bosom of the family, have academic culture as their native culture and can maintain a familiar rapport with it that implies the unconsciousness of its acquisition. So this is a classic Bourdieu style. The languages are convoluted, but I underscored the sentence, which is, I think, the essence here of Bourdieu's notions of privilege, the academic culture as their native culture. This is really, in my view, underlying Bourdieu's framework of privilege and ease. Basically is privilege, or students from privileged families, and basically they have their family culture, their native culture, very much in line with the academic culture. Therefore, the intergenerational transmission of privileges and advantages are really achieved in an imperceptible way, as Bourdieu said, and therefore it's very hard to students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds to even penetrate that kinds of a status. I think a lot of studies, including, I didn't really quote here, the unequal childhood. It's not focusing on higher education. It's really focusing on how social class really influence how parenting works. I think it's also very much in line with this academic culture as their native culture. Or I think the unequal childhood is really pointing at not just academic culture, but these mainstream institutions, how privileged kids, the ways that they were socialized or they were raised are well aligned with the mainstream institutional culture, so that they can have a seamless transition, can accumulate a lot of advantages when they move on to their adult life. Next slide, please. So this book, Privilege, also has been very influential. I think won the C. Wright Mills Award of ASA during that year, focusing on the elite boarding school in New Hampshire. It's called St. Paul School. And Shamus Khan very much followed Bourdieu's notions of privilege as ease, but identified something new about America, which is, unlike the French case, the ease in America really comes from the experience within the institution. So for example, the book here, Khan has taken a lot of time talking about how the schools have used school meals to train and practice the mannerism, the social interaction codes among the elite kids. So how the elite are really trained to carry themselves as if this is acquired in a very, the way they carry themselves looks very relaxed, very at ease, are actually out of countless of times of practice, okay? So therefore, Khan conclude that the very notion of ease carries this great trick. That trick is ease actually requires hard work. Which obscures privilege and essentially justifies meritocracy. So this is actually the great contribution this book has made, and really revealing that how this notion of meritocracy and this in general American dream is obscured by how the privileged is really indoctrinated and actually practiced and learned, so that people feel that the kinds of privilege or the kinds of status they have gained is really justified. So this is a different from the French case, but still in line with the notion of ease. They still appear to be very at ease and relaxed, and that is very much their embodied privilege. Next slide, please. So my question is how transnational education problematizes the whole of this. So why did I ask this question? I'm asking this from three angles, these 3 points make me question this Western notion of privilege. The first one is transnational elites do not really work within the system. They actually need to navigate the educational system differences. The second is between the education system differences, the differences are not neutral. American education has global power. So in other words, even if elites from a different country, they still have to succumb themselves to the standards and criteria of American education. A third is, other than education, transnational elites are subject to geopolitical headwinds. So in this particular case, we have COVID and US-China geopolitical tensions. Next slide, please. So here comes back to my central research question: how has transnational education transformed privilege? So I want to focus on 2 locations of privilege. One is accessing privilege, the other is experiencing privilege. So for my particular research, accessing privilege really materialize in terms of college applications and college admissions, and experiencing privilege really manifest in the campus experiences. Next slide, please. So in terms of accessing privilege, I was looking at the difference between the exam-based versus application-based system. So the exam-based system in China, we have this famous Gaokao, which is a Chinese college entrance examination. It's a national entrance examination, which is dated from the century-old civil service exam that really selected officials for ancient China. So that exists, hundreds of years, only ended in 1905. But that really shows there is a long tradition of exam, the central role that testing played in China in terms of selecting talent. So it has still a defining influence on Gaokao. So Gaokao in China determines not only college placement, but sometimes college major choices. So in other words, there is a hierarchy of scores for different majors based on the popularity of the majors, the marketability of the majors. But recent college reforms trying to incorporate non-exam components such as interviews, such as other types of considerations, non-exam-based extracurricular activity-based considerations, but those are actually under great scrutiny in terms of whether it's really meritocratic, but overall the scale is not fundamentally changing the dominant role of Gaokao. So in other words, the exam-based system in China is still very, very not only deep-rooted, but also long-lasting and impactful. But the American system is highly critical of the standardized high-stake testing. We all know that tests are never the only requirement of college admissions, and with the current SAT optional and GRE and other optional requirements, the tests are actually seem to be decreasing in terms of its importance. And so what does American system really include? It's so-called holistic application-based system. Next slide, please. So here I'd like to draw your attention to the book by Mitchell-Stevens, published in 2009, Creating a Class, College Admissions and the Education of Elites, really looking at the process of holistic admissions and how it really works. And according to Mitchell-Stevens, the holistic admissions criteria that characterize the American college admissions process are really demanding and broad. So his conclusion actually, in terms of the fussiness and elusiveness of holistic admissions actually carries a very important mechanism to reproduce social inequality. That's still for domestic Americans. But my argument is that the broad requirements of holistic admissions are not only distinct from the exam-based system in China, but also disconnected with the school experiences of Chinese students. So for example, few teachers in Chinese students' schools can write recommendation letters in English. And the guidance counselors, which is who are really a very important and necessary part of high schools, in average high school in America, are beyond reach for a large majority of Chinese students, if not exclusively. So to cope with the differences, Chinese students resort to for-profit agencies and they hire guidance counselors themselves. And that not only requires exorbitant amount of resources, but also put themselves at the mercy of a lot of exploitation and sometimes deceit, because this is a largely unregulated for-profit institutions. Next slide, please. So by the way, my argument basically is that holistic admissions in America creates cultural binds for Chinese international students. And that is something that elites in the West have not really experienced. So next, I want to focus on the international education and the power structure of higher education in the world. So my core argument is that the power of American education system in the global education structure is really one of the major reasons that drive elites in China to come to America for education. places like Columbia, we can see probably have drawn a lot of students, elite students from China. Ironically, it is also due to the power that elites in China are destined to lose their privileges, in part in this process from the start of college application to the real campus experiences, largely because they're coming from this system, which is the exam-based system that is disconnected from the application-based system. But they still want to come here no matter what, exactly because of the power structure of global higher education. Next slide, please. So next slide, please. So to highlight the power structure of global higher education, I want to present it to you, the top world university rankings by countries. This is the data from, there are a lot of world university rankings survey, and I intentionally use Shanghai Jiaotong University to highlight if there is any bias towards Chinese university. This is the data, which is still showing a huge gap between Chinese universities and American universities. For example, the top 20 in 2020, top 20 world universities, 15 are located in the US. There's none in China. Top 100, 41 located in the US, 6 are located in China. Top 200, 24 located in China, 65 in the United States. And going on and on, you can see that as the university is becoming more elite, fewer universities will be found in China. Even though Chinese higher education has made tremendous amount of progress. If you're looking at the difference between 2004 and 2020, if there is one country in the world that has made a prominent progress in the league of world-class universities, that is China. And actually, you can see that the US power has declined a little bit. But still, the advantages, the power that American higher education holds in the global higher education structure is enormous. You can see from this table. Next slide, please. The other thing is that Chinese students challenge Chinese students' privilege is this notion of neoracism and racialization. So scholars term this neoracism referring to discriminatory behaviors or attitudes based on language and cultural barriers and sometimes country of origin. So it's not just based on skin color. And the additional, I argue that the additional source of neoracism. So theoretically speaking, all international students are subject to neoracism, but the more dissimilar in terms of culture, in terms of language, in terms of geopolitical tensions are, the more likely the students from that country would experience neoracism. So the current US escalating US-China tensions obviously put Chinese students to additional set of pressure for neoracism. And another very important background is anti-China context here in the United States, which is pretty dramatic now. Over 70% of American public now have negative views about China. And I haven't really presented the statistics here, which is almost like parallel, that this increasing negative attitudes towards Chinese students is parallel with their increasing negative attitudes towards China. Next slide, please. So my design is comparative cohort study. I was looking at 2 cohorts of students pre-COVID and post-COVID. And so the second cohort interviews are still ongoing. Next slide, please. I focus on full-time undergraduate students at 4-year institutions. Next slide, please. I was also conducting some kind of online ethnography, which is something new to me, and especially people are talking about because the travel ban is very hard to go to China nowadays. increasingly important to study China from elsewhere. And I think online actually presents a hugely potential rich information. So I was following WeChat groups. I follow two types of groups. One is student groups, the other are parent groups. And this is, I would say, locations of information and even emotion sharing, the locations of anxiety. And next slide, please. So now I want to present some findings here in two segments. First is in terms of accessing privilege. Next slide, please. So accessing privilege, really a couple of very interesting findings, or paradoxical. So Chinese students exhibit strong education desires. So education desires have been reported previously by Vanessa Fong's research and also Kipnis. I think we're using the same title of education desire book. But what I identify from Chinese international students is a set of contradictions of their desires. So the first is they're trying to, the education desire is just like any other Chinese students in China, which is based on the exam-based system, that is to get the highest test scores possible. But for Chinese international students, they have a competing desire, which is to escape from the high-stake testing to American liberal arts education that presumably does not fixate on test scores. So in other words, some Chinese students, they are not doing well in the exam-based system, but other Chinese students, they're doing well in the exam-based system. But in terms of education philosophy, they don't like or they don't believe in the kinds of education or test-based education the Chinese model has presented. So they desire for the so-called well-roundedness of American liberal arts education that emphasize critical thinking, creativity, open dialogue, that aim to cultivate a well-rounded human beings. So these two education desires are very much contradictory or even competing. But in terms of Chinese students trying to access the privilege of American higher education, you can see the tensions of these two. Next slide, please. So the tensions are really manifest in terms of the impact of the testing culture. So I was asking whether in the process of applying to American colleges, because it's a holistic admission, test scores do not matter entirely, is testing culture alleviated? With the absence of Gaokao, is testing culture not as tense as before? My finding is really the opposite. Gaokao is replaced by the pressures of new tests and actually more tests. Gaokao, you took it once. And then if you want to take it again, you have to wait another year. But TOEFL, SAT, you can take it several times a year. That's how Chinese students take advantage of it. They oftentimes took multiple tests, multiple TOEFL, multiple SAT, multiple AP. And they want to maximize or achieve the best scores possible. Why? Because they perceive that American universities are becoming more and more selective now. Their score requirements, for example, this student from Emory University saying that they have this perception that American universities have this particular set of requirements for Chinese students because they can see they're getting increasingly competitive, the scores are getting higher and higher. And in other words, it is essentially, a misfit between exam-based mindset and elusive holistic criteria. A lot of Chinese students are telling me that they have no control over recommendation letters, no control over the kinds of essays they can be evaluated. What they can only have control is test scores. That's exactly the kinds of mindset they carry themselves in the exam-based system. So therefore, the testing culture is not alleviated. that creates a lot of anxieties, a lot of sort of uncertainties about what really matters, to what extent their effort counts. Next slide, please. So accessing privilege in the COVID presents unique challenges. So here I have a quote from a student from Boston University. My parents and I were really reluctant to leave China because we're not sure whether and when I can return because it's so hard to fly back. Also, the families are very concerned about the COVID management in the United States. They feel like sending us to harm's way. So that is a really poignant statement. Next slide, please. So a lot of parents facing travel bans and very unpredictable air ticket situations, flight cancellations, and also changing visa policies. Their coping mechanisms is to buy multiple tickets to assuage risk of changing policies. So here, this student from Irvine, they have a quarter system. So the quarter system introduced the problem of the challenge of their I-20 date aspiration. Luckily in the spring of 2020, the school has changed the policy for the I-20, but the parents are so anxious that they're afraid the policies will be changed back. So they bought 2 tickets. They said that they grab tickets day and night, 每日每夜的刷票, huh? This is the sentence I've heard many times from students to trying to navigate this very uncertain terrains of flight cancellation. Next slide, please. So now the question is, I think a lot of American professors and students are also wondering, so why? Why do they still want to come here? Why do they still want to put their children to harm's way, so to speak, if the COVID situation are so horrific in the United States compared to China? A lot of it they're on this irreversible path. So first of all, they don't really consider dropouts. Unlike American students, we all know that we have a 50% college nationwide dropout rate, but there's no culture of college dropout in China, especially for this cohort of students putting to so much effort and resources. They don't really consider dropout. They have a very strong commitment to getting their American degrees, no matter what. And secondly, some of them are on international tracks. If they're high school students, they're already deciding like a couple years, like 9th grade or 10th grade, or even younger, to apply abroad to study for their colleges. So there's no easy way to change tracks and go back to Gaokao system. Next slide, please. So here is what I got from the WeChat, the parent groups. I personally was very moved by this picture. You can see that there is a man almost like doing the push-up on the floor of Shanghai Pudong Airport. What is he doing? He's actually sending his son off, and his son off to America, and his son going through the security check and that big fence. He could not really see his son anymore. That's why he was literally lying on the floor trying to take a last peek of his son. So parents group was talking about this, what social scientists would call double bind caused by COVID, that damned if you do, damned if you don't. Like if you do send your kids successfully to America, realizing their original plans of studying abroad, you're so afraid and concerned of COVID situation, as well as of the travel situation. When is the next time you're able to see your child again? Because it's so hard for them to come back and so hard to get a ticket. Damned if you don't. Like if you don't send them abroad, that is a whole series of family planning of years of resources wasted and in vain. As I said, there's irreversible path to be perceived among their parents, these parents and their children, that there's no other choices, so to speak. Next slide, please. So next part of the finding is experiencing privilege, which is about their campus experiences. Next slide, please. So here I was giving you the book cover of another book, I think published in 2014 by Elizabeth Armstrong and Laura Hamilton, which is a study of Midwest research universities and how a college maintains inequality. This is a study about American students, actually American women students. And essentially it is finding that how party culture has actually created this mechanism of inequality and really making a lot of lower income American students marginalized and alienated. And I found very similar thing with regards to Chinese students. That's why I was concluding, this is actually I report in my book, that Chinese students, despite their relative economic privileges, find parallel experiences with low-income college students in feeling alienated and marginalized in the college party scene. So this is, the party part is just one aspect of it. The overall social experiences for Chinese students on American college campuses are very much alienating and marginalizing. So their economic privilege obscures their cultural and social marginalization. And that part is largely very much ignored by American higher education administration. And that part I very much highlighted in my book. Next slide, please. So essentially, they experience status loss from the privileged majority in China to the marginalized minority in the United States. And with that comes on a daily basis what we would call microaggression. So here is a dialogue that I've had with a student about, this question of eating dogs. And you can see that. And this is just one example of microaggression that Chinese students feel very powerless and useless to engage in these kinds of dialogue that, romantically speaking, it could be an intercultural dialogue, but why somehow it becomes dead end and somehow is constitute microaggression, because as this student has highlighted, that he feels that when Americans are talking about this, they've already had a bad attitude. They're judging, they're negatively judging when they're asking this. And this is not just isolated event. And I want to say, just a couple months ago in Texas, school district, a teacher has put Chinese student eating in one of their tests, quiz items. Of course, that was identified and the teacher apologized, but you can see that kind of culture has been very much pervasive, and it's not an isolated event, and it could put Chinese students in a very, very precarious and hurtful situation. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So the other thing that really shows this very limitations of Bourdieusian conversions of capital is college major choices. So what I found is, unlike their privileged peers in the West or in China, who tend to major in humanities and liberal arts fields, Chinese international students still gravitate towards practical fields such as STEM and business, largely because their cultural capital largely has become irrelevant in the United States. Next slide, please. So in the COVID era, privilege sometimes is not just challenged, but also upended. This is especially in terms of online education. And, I think, without me saying it, Chinese international students are really experiencing it firsthand, how online education in the middle of the night feels like. Next slide, please. And then it is racism. So Neoracism and microaggression has been reported before COVID, but after COVID or during COVID, Chinese international students sometimes have experienced racism for the first time. So this is a student from Williams College was talking about what the real experience happening to him, and he was staying in the United States for 7 years without experiencing anything like that, but COVID hit, things have changed. And I also have conducted research about mask, and I published it last year. A lot of Chinese students experienced racism when they were the first group of people on campus wearing masks. And they were very, very much sometimes attacked, sometimes avoided, marginalized, and sometimes confronted by their professors. That was in spring 2020. Next slide, please. And this is further clouded by US-China tensions. And most recently, Winter Olympics, and we know that it has been politicized, and American government has a diplomatic boycott and use, sort of genocide to describe what happened in Xinjiang. So I had students talking that the conversation felt very, very hard for them to hear in the United States, and they feel like their American classmates seem not to be willing to have a rational conversation. If you have used such words as genocide, how can you be cool-headed if the official US position is so hostile towards China? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes. So, all right. So I want to wrap up and leave more time for Q&A. So my conclusion is, for Chinese international students, their privilege comes without ease. There are two additional features that really complicate privilege for Chinese international students. Anxiety, that is very much the case in terms of they're preparing for applications and college admissions for the American college applications, because the two systems are so different, as well as their campus experiences in terms of social integrations. I haven't even talked about the campus academic experiences. And the second is fragility. And I think COVID really has made the fragile part very much explicit. Literally, they cannot fly back home. Literally, they cannot really see their parents. Literally, they worry about their visa status. So overall, Chinese students, in spite of their privileged status in terms of socioeconomic situations, have experienced status loss. They cannot achieve the traditional Bourdieusian conversion of capital. And they cannot really achieve that kind of embodiment of ease as found in the elites of the Western society. And COVID just exacerbated this loss. Next slide, please. And I also identified the structural sources for privilege without ease. There are two main sources. One is the power of American higher education. As long as American higher education still holds tremendous amount of power, the elite schools are primarily located in America. The elites of Chinese students will continue to flock here, and they would continue to strive hard and have challenging time to fit in and navigate a lot of very difficult circumstances. And the second is the US-China geopolitical tensions that would cloud a lot of things and make things difficult for transnational students. Next slide, please. So now the question is, if the research is based on the case of Chinese international students, what is a broad broad-based relevance. And I think it's broadly applicable to those engaged with transnational education whose home country is not part of the US. That really means that if their home country is not part of the US, their education system will be very much different, and the challenges of navigating the two will be definitely bearing on the students themselves. And then the home country is not part of the US also refers to the geopolitical sense. And that we can see, happens to Russia as well, even though we don't really have a lot of Russian students, but definitely Russian community or Russian people got canceled recently due to the recent Russia-Ukraine crisis. So you can see that is definitely, those are the broad sources of the problems that transnational students or students with transnational education have to confront and anticipate the problem. Next slide. That's it. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions, comments.
All right. Yingyi, thank you so much for a fascinating talk. I mean, it's really rich data in such a timely study that sort of capture the increasing Chinese international students flow in the past decade or so and how it intersected with COVID. So everyone else, please submit your questions through Q&A